Welcome back to the Mold Show. I'm your host, Adam Horn. As always, my co-host, Sean McGrath. For those who are tuning in for the first time, this show is about mold. What do you do when you find out you have mold, or how you find out you have mold? We're here to answer your questions and kind of go over some of the typical scenarios and just paint the picture for the basics of mold exposures, starting from testing to remediation. And today we're going to talk about remediation, which is my expertise. Sean is a state licensed mold assessor. I'm a state licensed mold remediator. We joined forces to talk about the process. And that's what we're here to do. So Sean, how you been, man?
Been great. It's been a few weeks. Have you've been busy lately? You stayed around the state? You've been traveling? What have you been up to?
All the above. Traveling in state, looking at different projects, trying to help people, navigate the craziness that is the water damage and mold exposure landscape. And it's always interesting. Every single project is unique. They may have some similarities, but they're always unique.
Yeah, we put in a lot of miles since the last time we chatted. I mean, South Florida, Jacksonville. I think we've been up to Tallahassee. Next week, or maybe 2 weeks from now, we've got a Milwaukee trip on the books, South Carolina trip on the books. So we're staying busy. So I'm good to hear you are too.
So what you're saying is it doesn't really matter where you live or what the climate is. You have the potential to have a mold issue.
That's a really good point. I'm surprised we haven't talked about that yet. Yeah. Water damage mold does not discriminate based off of climate, which is one of those myths out there. A lot of people think just because we're in Florida, but sure, our climate's great for water intrusion because of all the rain we get, all the humidity we get year round. But we get calls from all over the country. Again, it doesn't discriminate. You're still going to have your plumbing leaks. You're still going to have your AC issues, your catastrophic water bursts that cause floods. You're still going to have your water intrusion, your roof leaks.
Yep.
So yeah, it really doesn't matter where you live.
Yeah, if you have indoor plumbing, the recipe is there. You can live in the desert, but doesn't mean you're not going to have exposures on the interior buildings. So, like I said earlier, we wanted to kind of jump into the mold remediation side. We've talked a lot about what to do, where to go if you think you may have mold, and in some of our previous episodes and clips, really delved in deep to that phase of it. And so, I think it's a good idea to kind of get into stage one of what do I do once I know I have mold. And, once I have the report from the assessor or the protocol from the assessor, where do I go from here?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time talking about our side of things the last couple episodes. Time to hand the ball over to you.
Yeah.
Once we get our job done, what happens next? Once our client has the report, they know what they're dealing with.
Yep.
They often ask us for remediators, and I'm sure that's when you get your phone call. So why don't you walk us through what that first contact with the client looks like?
If I'm fortunate enough to get a referral and they do already have that information in hand, and the first step is for me to also get a copy of that report so I can take a look and see what the recommendations are, see what the testing tells us, and what the assessor's report recommends. And then I go out and do my own site inspection along with that information to come up with a plan or a scope so I can put together an estimate for what it's going to take in order to achieve the remediation. And so usually I get the report, I'll review it independently. I'll make an appointment with the client. We'll go out, talk it over, find out what ultimately they understand is necessary, find out if they have any reservations, if they're willing to do everything that's recommended, or if they're not willing to do everything that's recommended, and they only want to do some of it. Those variables we try to discuss ahead of time, because it usually is quite an undertaking, especially when the report calls for quite a bit of remediation. What I always tell people is there's really two types of remediation projects that at least I find myself handling these days. You have targeted remediation projects where you've identified, through testing, you've identified areas that have growth, and then a lot of the home has no issue. And in those cases, we are containing off, if we can, those spaces from the remainder of the home to remediate those spaces only. And then you have the other type, which is whole house remediation. And you still may only have targeted areas that have growth, but it may also include the entire HVAC system or the entire attic being affected in some way. And ultimately, the client wants the entire house cleaned after the remediation of the targeted areas are done. So that's what I'm there to typically find out initially. I use that information that the testing companies provide my clients and me, and then that's just a starting point. We've talked about this several times. Sampling is just a snapshot of a small area a lot of times, and ultimately we don't know the scope or the breadth of the work until we get in there and start removing materials. And so we can get into that here in a second in regards to what happens once we start removing it. But essentially, that's where I start. I get the report, I meet with the client, I do my own visual inspection so I can get a lay of how the home or business or building is laid out, and then put together a plan and an estimate for how we're going to do it.
Well, let me throw this scenario out at you. What does it look like when, say, a homeowner calls you and they haven't had an inspection done and they just have certain areas they've already made up their mind they want to work on, but they haven't had any type of assessment or testing done?
Then we're limited to very little information. You can go in and assume an area requires remediation, but without sampling, without testing, we don't know for sure what it is we're dealing with. But that's not even the tough part. We don't know where to stop in a lot of cases. And so testing for me isn't necessarily to tell me that the mold is there, because I think in a lot of cases that's pretty obvious. It's really to tell me where it isn't in a lot of cases, so I can draw a circle around or cordon off certain parts of the building or space, in anticipation of the materials that we're going to have to remove. So you can't. Some people don't have the means or the resources to test initially, and maybe they only want to post test. And in those cases, where there is no testing involved, we can only go based on what's visible. And a lot of times there's not a whole lot there. You can assume just based on the condition of the space or maybe the history of the project, or there's been a water damage exposure there. And ultimately the likelihood is high that there's probably some growth in and around those areas, and then treat it, whether there's testing or not, treat it like it does have mold, because there's no putting the clown back in the box. Once you open it up, if there's mold there and you haven't put the proper protections in place, you run the risk of cross-contaminating other areas of the environment without, and you have to assume at that point, at least from a remediator's perspective, if I'm cutting into a wall or removing material, I'm assuming that there's growth behind it.
Yeah, you brought up a good point, because I can't tell you how many people we've helped after the fact when maybe just a general contractor has gone in there thinking mold's not a very big deal, or the area is, just a small little spot. And before you know it, they make it twice as worse or twice as bad as what it already was because they've cross contaminated the rest of the home. Then instead of it being just maybe a few isolated spots, it becomes a whole house remediation.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been there. That's one of the purposes of you and I even doing this podcast in the first place. I wouldn't know any better if I wasn't in and around this industry. And so hiring a contractor to come in and demo my bathroom or my kitchen, or, start tearing apart my home for renovation without any kind of protections in place wouldn't have even been a thought of mine had I not, had the knowledge that I have now. And so, and we find a lot of clients like that where they'll be midway through the renovation and their contractor's done no dust prevention. Not even on our scale, right? Just basic things like protecting the HVAC system from dust, from whatever materials it is you're disturbing. Just basic things, protecting your belongings and your bedding and your pillows and everything from just construction debris, let alone moldy construction debris. So that's the idea here. We want to talk about ultimately what this is. And remediation, I tell people all the time, I try to simplify it just so they can kind of digest what it is we do. It is demo with lots of controls in place, and then a guerrilla level cleaning effort during and after the demo is been done. And that is an oversimplification, but in a nutshell, that's what we do. We remove the cosmetic materials that have been exposed to growth, go as far as we can visibly, chase it, and then further. Usually what's customary is 2 to 4 feet beyond the visible growth, but not necessary in some cases. Just depends on ultimately what material it is you're removing and how sure you are it hasn't gone past those areas. So that's the guide map that most remediators follow. And again, it's not a situation where we always know. As a matter of fact, we don't always know. In some cases, it's way worse than we anticipated, and in some cases, there's nothing visibly there. But we still have to treat it like there could be something non-visible because we're dealing with microbial growth here. So again, that may be an oversimplification, but basically that is a description of kind of what remediation is.
Yeah, sometimes we don't know either.
Yeah.
As thorough as we are, sometimes I'm shocked at the feedback that we get back from remediators,
Yeah.
how far the damage extended. A lot of times what we found is just the tip of the iceberg. And
Yep.
sometimes we're expecting really bad damage and
Yep.
it's minimal. So yeah, you just never know.
We're going to talk a lot about the materials used in residential and commercial construction in this state and really probably all over the planet. A lot has to do with that. Water damage exposures are going to happen, and ultimately intelligent building practices could prevent a lot of these issues just from an accessibility standpoint, or the materials that are in these spaces to begin with that a lot of times lead to these big issues. And for most people, it's out of sight, out of mind. When you have a water damage exposure, you visibly think things have dried up, but you don't ultimately consider all of the materials, the plies of materials that got wet and saturated and soaked and stayed wet for an extended period of time. And doesn't take much. Could be one exposure, one major exposure, or even one minor exposure to start the growth process. And then the more it gets exposed to moisture, the more materials get exposed to that growth, and the more it will continue to grow. And if the environment is perfect for growth, or imperfect, depending on the conditions of the building, it can get out of hand in some cases. We've seen that quite a bit with like snowbird type settings where there's not a whole lot of oversight. They leave home for months at a time, go up north for the summer and come down here for the winter. And once they come down here and check on their condo, it's covered completely in growth because of some event, or the air conditioning stopped working and there was a flood of some type. So too many scenarios to discuss all at once, but it again, it's not hard to get yourself in a situation where you find growth, and you have to be diligent about attacking it. Otherwise, it's potentially going to get worse and then potentially spread to other areas. So we encourage you guys to do your due diligence and attack it if you know that you could potentially have an issue there.
Well, you've done a good job of relating your kind of initial steps with our inspection and report.
Yeah.
Why don't you walk us through the process once you do have areas that are kind of isolated as source areas, and how you go about setting up those areas for remediation?
Okay. Isolated job. We'll do a typical bathroom type exposure. Okay. Your typical 5x10 bathroom, tub, or shower type installation. Let's say you've had testing done. You know that there's an issue. It's an older shower tub. That's why you had somebody come out in the first place, because you figured that you may have had an exposure in there. And that room has a room on either side of it, right? So you got the bathroom and tub in the middle, and a room on one side and a room on another side. Let's say the goal is to tear out the shower and the tub, maybe pull the toilet, the baseboards behind the toilet, maybe even pull the vanity out of there as well, because we're concerned that moisture had gotten out of that space. So if my first goal is to identify how I'm going to contain those areas from the rest of the building, and how I'm going to get in and out of that environment, me and my crew. And there's a couple different ways you can contain, but ultimately you kind of leave that up to the remediation company to determine how some people will go in and out of windows with debris and materials. Some will contain to an exit door, which is kind of the approach I like to take if that's feasible in a lot of cases. But essentially the goal is to contain those rooms from the remainder of the building, identify what areas of those spaces need to be sealed off. And that always starts with the HVAC system. We have to seal off any of the returns that could be pulling air that we are contaminating by disturbing the materials into the system. So we are either shutting off the HVAC system. In most cases, that's typically the case. A lot of times the HVAC systems are also a part of the process. They have already been contaminated, or they have their own growth situation. So generally speaking, once we've contained it and sealed off the HVAC system, and sealed off any of the holes or any of the areas that could potentially allow dust to either come in or out of, then we begin by putting our equipment in, filtering those walls to get the pressure proper in those spaces. Whether it's setting up negative pressure by pushing or filtering air and pushing it out of a window, or having a positive pressure situation where you're just constantly exchanging the air. The goal is ultimately to isolate that space and kind of create a vacuum chamber of sorts, so that the materials we are disturbing, we're constantly cleaning the air while we're doing it. Remove as much material as we think that we need to, typically down to the framing of that space. And then once that's done, we're cleaning everything, including the framing and the things that we've exposed. Some of the cavities that we open up, things of that nature. Again, lots of variables in place, but it typically involves removing or demoing cosmetic material, especially the growth material, chasing it as far as as far as we can see the damage, and then a little bit further just to be sure that there's nothing we can't see, and then cleaning and the air first and foremost, and then the surfaces in there, and that process is repeated several times over the course of the project until we've gotten the counts down in the air, and we've obviously cleaned the surfaces. to remove as much dust and particulate from the environment that we've just introduced into the airspace. And there's other methods we use as well. Sometimes we'll fog that airspace to help knock down what's in the air. Think of like, after a rain or snow, it helps us knock down the particulate in the air down to the surfaces, and then we re-clean those surfaces. But essentially, that's it. We're not using any harsh chemicals in most cases to kill mold. The idea of remediation isn't about killing mold. And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings, I guess. I don't know, not a great word for it, but it's one of the things that people think that we're going in there to do. The goal is not to kill it. It's to remove as much of it as we can gain access to, and then clean the surfaces within those spaces. We're not using any biocides typically. In some cases, we'll use peroxide cleaners, but that's not being used to kill mold. It's being used as a exfoliant to help it remove it off of the surfaces it may be growing on, like the framing or the block or the subflooring or the concrete. Other methods like wire brushing or sanding, an abrasive process usually is being done to the materials that are left over. And that's usually the framing and the block and the structure itself. We're usually using those processes to remove as much as we can from those surfaces, cleaning those surfaces in the process several times. And then in some cases, applying like antimicrobial encapsulants on top of the framing in certain areas where you have limited access to get to clean. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how those things work. The reason I kind of painted the picture of a bathroom with 2 bedrooms on either side is because a lot of times the common walls are affected.
Yep.
You think it's just the bathroom, but you really have to draw a circle around the water damage exposure. You assume that it leached into the materials around it as well. And if you're opening up areas where there's other areas where there's plumbing, like on the back side of you're taking down a wall and the back side of that wall is the kitchen wall, or another bathroom, like a bathroom on one wall and bathroom on another wall. You have to kind of prepare for potentially finding other damage from other sources. And that's another thing that we do too. We try to help the homeowner or the business owner or the building owner identify the source. Some cases it's wear and tear, old shower, poor installation, poor tile job, shower pan wasn't installed properly. Somewhere along the line, somebody made a mistake, or the home is just in need of renovation. And that's important. Why is it there in the first place? The testing helps identify if it's there, but it's not always clear why. And sometimes we don't have that answer until we start pulling the materials out. And even in some cases, it's there's questions, but for the most part, we usually are able to identify why it happened in the first place. And that's really important for people who are trying to determine who's going to be responsible for it. If they're filing an insurance claim, or if they've had a contractor in there who didn't do the job properly, or if they're just trying to avoid it ever happening again, which is probably the most common scenario, right? I have it. I never want to go through this process again. It's evasive. I've had to move myself out of the home, move all my belongings out of these spaces. Oh, that's another thing I failed to mention. In preparation in these projects, we or the homeowner have moved their belongings out of all of those spaces because we want to try to avoid contaminating their stuff. And so ultimately they're either being brought to an area so they can be cleaned, or put out in an area, another part of the home, while we're doing the remediation in those spaces. And we'll get into belongings and contents cleaning and stuff probably at a later date. But that's just a quick description of an average type exposure that you might find yourself having to deal with. If you own a home or a business and it has a bathroom, it's probably not if, it's when you have some type of plumbing issue or water damage exposure in there, and then you have to find out, ultimately if it's resulted in an issue. And that's why testing is so important, because a lot of times it's not visibly evident, and you could be, living with it without knowing.
So going back a little bit, you talked about two things that I think should seem obvious, but are overlooked a lot more than you would think. You mentioned cleaning the surfaces at least 3 or 4 times, I think. And I can't tell you how many times we go in after remediation, it doesn't look like the surfaces where the demo was done were even touched. I mean, not HEPA vacuumed, not wiped down and sanitized. I mean, that's where the mold was growing.
Right.
We have to clean those surfaces, the framing, the block, what have you, before any building material goes back up, or we're leaving an environment perfect, heaven forbid, a little more humidity or moisture in that area for it to get out of control again and happen all over again.
Right.
So the process that you talked about, multiple rounds of cleaning the surfaces, HEPA vacuuming the surfaces, it's so important, because the last thing we want to see as assessors is going in there and seeing visible growth still in the framing, seeing dust, dirt, and debris behind a little plastic wall that they use to cover up, where they demoed.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be pristine before any building material goes back up. And I don't understand why more companies from the assessment side don't do surface testing on the back end to validate that remediation. We got everything back to normal fungal ecology.
Well, there's no good way. There's no meaningful documentation other than testing post remediation. You can take the word of your assessor, or your, not your assessor, excuse me. You can take the word of your remediator that they did a good job, but without getting some post-test sampling, it's an assumption. And even visually, it may look good, but we always like to have that confirmation. At least me as a remediator, I'd like to have that lab confirmation. When we say lab, and if you've listened to our previous shows talking about testing, usually testing is 2-phase. You have testing before to determine what is it I'm dealing with, and then after the remediation is done, post-testing to confirm that the remediator you hired did it to a testable standard or got it back to what you said, a normal fungal ecology. And there's really no way to get that answer or make that determination any other way. So from the standpoint of making sure you're thorough, visually should always look good. The visual standard a lot of times isn't enough though. And there are plenty of cases where we'll remediate and it looks great. And then, testing will occur afterwards. And there could be some areas where there's still elevations that require additional cleaning. The cleaning process is everything. Anybody can go in there and demo a space. Any contractor can do that. Any handyman can do that. Any renovator can go in and demo the space and just be generally clean, but it's never going to be to the standard of a remediator, or it shouldn't be unless they really know what they're doing. And kudos to them if they do. But yeah, the visual standard is just the base. It's just the starting point. That's why it's so important that you are as thorough as possible, make as many passes as possible to remove as much visible dust and particulate as possible. And then there has to be oversight involved. And I encourage you to have these discussions with your remediator before you have the remediation done. Understand
100%.
Understand what are we trying to achieve here. Not all my clients test afterwards, and that's their prerogative. There's nobody's going to hold your feet to the fire and say you should or you have to do this. And that's fine as long as we agree to those things beforehand. I need to know ultimately what standard I'm being hired. I mean, I try to meet the standard regardless of whether it's testing or not, but ultimately I need to know, what we agreed to. If we're not doing the whole home, or if we're not doing every room that's recommended in the protocol, that's fine too. ultimately, I just need to make sure that you know that there are limitations, that we're limiting our remediation to this scope of work. And if we agree to it, we'll do that. And not everybody can afford to do their whole home all at once. Some will take the worst of the areas, and then usually it's the HVAC system. And I always encourage people to be relentless with their issues with their HVAC system. And we'll probably do more than one episode just on air conditioning, because it's just such a it's such a one of the main culprits in
It's the
my
lungs of the house.
personal opinion. Yeah, lungs of the home, and usually has, not usually, a lot of times has exposures and growth in it, because it's an environment that's ripe for moisture, and then, depending on how diligent you are with maintenance and how diligent you are with cleaning your systems and changing your air filters, all those things matter, believe it or not, when you're talking about a clean system. And so, um, what you said in regards to holding the remediator to a standard, that should be done by the assessor, but that should also be done by the homeowner. And that comes through education. Know what you are hiring the company for. No, ultimately, uh, you know, understand what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve by even having the remediation done in the first place.
Yeah, and cleaning is more than just spraying a product on it
Yeah,
too. I mean, the mold growth, this roots are going to penetrate the substrate. So
yeah,
if you're
it's
not
physical.
using abrasive,
Yeah,
strategies, like you said, the mold's still going to be in that substrate. So
yeah.
you
I'll,
got to
I'll go
clean it.
into that a little deeper. It starts with the removal of the material that we are going to remove, right? Cutting out the drywall, removing the baseboards, removing the carpet and pad, tearing out the tub, tearing out the tile, removing the moldy vanity, taking out the wet and water damaged flooring, right? That's phase one of the removal process. Phase two is all of what you're left over with, right? We clean after that. We do a cleaning. And then we're focusing on what's left over. The floor, the subfloor, wooden or concrete, the framing, wooden or metal, or block, whatever the materials are made of. That's where the abrasive process comes in. Now we have to try to clean those surfaces as good as possible. That starts with a wire brushing or a sanding or a peroxide cleaning, and then we're going back and washing them down and HEPA vacuuming them again. You mentioned HEPA vacuuming. That process happens more times than I can even count. You are trying to remove the material and all the dust you've created during that demo process, and that only comes through vacuuming and physically removing and washing down the surfaces with usually a plant-based detergent, something with a surfactant in it, and fresh, clean microfiber towels, hundreds of them depending on
Yeah.
the exposure. New towels always, and just going through and re-cleaning the surfaces over and over and over again until it meets the visible standard. And then you're waiting a while and coming back once you know that the air is clean enough to where you're not getting particulates settling back on those spaces. You do a final clean, and then you let the air cleaning equipment kind of run. Usually the standard is 24 to 48 hours, I think, for most companies. Usually that's what's recommended before you have some testing done. So they'll come in and hopefully swab and take air samples in those spaces to confirm, visually confirm also that it looks like it was done properly, and then get the testing confirmation to back that up. That's always what's recommended. Everybody has their own methodology with these things, but that is just a quick description of a isolated type of exposure. And back to what I was talking about before, not only are we cleaning the area that we've torn the materials out, but everything within the spaces that we've contained also gets cleaned from ceiling to floor. We are washing the ceilings, we are washing the walls, we are washing the floors. And then anywhere that we've been working in or walking through with the debris typically is clean, unless we've provided ourselves a decontainment chamber, and we can talk about those types of things at some point too. I don't want to get too wordy with this, but generally speaking, that's how these processes work. We bag the debris or remove it out a window or get it out of the building any way possible, and then focus on really getting that space as clean as possible. And we're usually working in concert with an air conditioning contractor. I mentioned it before. Sometimes they'll do their cleaning or removal of the system before we even get in there. Then we do the remediation of the space, and ultimately they come back and install a fresh new system after the remediation is done. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that, but typically it's either we're doing it together at the same time, they're doing it before or after. But HVAC cleaning or replacement is usually a component of the process.
Yeah, it always amazes me how you have to play quarterback with all these different companies to make sure they don't cross-contaminate your work and vice versa.
Yeah.
But another point I like that you made is the fact that, the point isn't to quote unquote kill the mold, right? We're trying to physically remove as many spores and fragments as possible from the environment. All these other steps are just to help clean and sanitize the area. And you brought up a good point about fogging, right? The point of your fogging procedure isn't to quote unquote kill the mold spores.
Correct.
It's to help with the extra particles that are floating around in the air, bring them down to the surface so you can physically wipe them up and physically remove them from the space. It's very helpful because while you're running your equipment, you're going to be constantly kicking things up, stirring things up.
Correct.
And there's always going to be particles that are smaller than what that HEPA filtration is capable of, pulling out of the air. So it's a great extra measure as part of the process, but it should never be sold as a substitute for remediation to, kill any contaminants that are in your home.
Yeah, I wish there was a magical fairy fog that we could spray.
That'd be great.
Into the walls. And until nanobot technology gets to the point where we can do that, I don't recommend, trying to approach it using biocides and bleaches and things like that. You're really better if you're going to take half measures, you're better off encapsulating it all than you are actually trying to kill it. And I think we've seen people try to take that approach on bathroom ceilings all the time. We're going to probably do several episodes just on bathroom and the fact that there's no humidity control in most bathrooms, and the fact that most ceilings in showers end up growing molds, and people try to bleach them and wipe them and paint them over and over and over again. And what ends up happening, the mold just continues to come back. And that's because it's still there, and because it's still an environment where molds like to grow. So, it's not as simple necessarily as killing it. You want to remove it so it's not there in concentrated forms, growth areas in concentrated forms. And I preach that to people all the time. My goal as a remediator, is to attack growth areas. That's really ultimately what I care about. I am definitely trying to remove the dust counts and get things back down to a normal fungal ecology. But I'm more concerned with growth areas. There isn't a building on this planet that won't have some level of dust in it, that has some measure of mold spores in it, and it will after the remediation as well. But you should never be okay with growth situations in an interior environment. And when I say never, I mean never. That's whether you're aware of any type of issues it may be causing you or not. It doesn't belong in an enclosed environment with us in these confined spaces. Otherwise, you run the risk of having issues, and not everybody does, or not everybody is aware, and I respect that. And I'm not here to tell you how you feel. Ultimately, I'm here to tell you it probably doesn't belong there, and ultimately there is a way to remove it using the methodologies that I didn't create. There are lots of other abatement industries out there that came along well before mold remediation, and mold removal is just a fancy word for, or remediation is just a fancy word for removal. And when you're trying to remove contaminated materials, there's a method that has been used for a long time, to try to get them out of the buildings and try to limit any type of secondary damage you do while doing that, or what you'll hear us talk about all the time, cross contamination. You want to limit that. In some cases, it's difficult, but you want to do what you can to limit that, because you don't want to make things worse necessarily. You're there to try to make things better, and that's why I'm so diligent about attacking the growth areas, because those are usually the areas that most people are symptomatic from.
Yeah, that's what I call phase one of remediation. If people choose to do phase two,
Yeah.
which is in those circumstances where there's been cross contamination of the areas of the house,
Mm-hmm.
that takes place after we've prioritized the source remediation. That needs to be
Yeah,
accomplished first before we
it
even think
does.
about phase two, or else phase two is all for nothing.
Yeah. Let's say you bought an older home. Chances are there's probably been renovations in that building, and unlikely to any real clean standard. That's usually not the goal of a renovation contractor, to keep the place clean. They're in there to give you a new kitchen, a new bathroom, or put in new floors, or maybe new windows, or whatever the case may be. And so, whatever they did, whatever they tore out without protecting the environment, those dusts stay in that home. And you'll talk more about some of the composite dust sampling that you guys do, in environments, which talk about what's left over after all these renovation projects, and ultimately, what you could be exposing yourself to, if not just the ingredients for potential growth. So, yeah, like I said, there's no perfect environment. The goal, whenever I'm involved, ultimately, when it finally gets to me and a customer hires me to do it, then the standard is to try to remove as much dust and particulate from the environment as possible. Killing mold is never the focus. If some of it happens to die during the removal process, whatever, but that's not our goal, and we're not using those practices necessarily to try to kill it. It is a removal process, when you get down to it.
Agree 100%. So we've taken quite a bit walking through that process. You mind if we kind of switch gears here and maybe go through a few questions that I feel are important as an assessor to ask a remediator when you're kind of going through that due diligence phase of things, trying to figure out what company you might want to move forward with if you do decide to remediate. Some of these are simple, but I still think they're really important to get a good idea of who you might be working with here. And it starts with a simple one. You need to ask your remediator if they're licensed or certified. There's several states. Ours is one of them, Florida, that requires to have a license for remediation, and assessments have to be separate. And you have to have some sort of certification that's recognized nationally. There's several out there. A few of them, IICRC, NORMI, ACAC, something that's nationally recognized. That shows that they're keeping up with their continuing education and at least somewhat educated in the basic steps of remediation.
Right.
Anything to add to that, Adam?
I always encourage people to reach out and get some referrals as well.
That's going to be my point number 2, especially if you're sick, you think your house is making you sick, you're immune compromised in some way, shape, or form. I think it's important to have referrals and testimonials of success stories.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to know what the process is going to be like, talk to somebody who's been through it before. If you want to get a gauge for how competent the company that you're hiring is, Talk to some of their previous customers. Some of it you have to be concerned. Maybe they're cherry picking and giving you their best recommendations, but it's still important to have these conversations. One, for education purposes, right? You want to understand, what is it like? How long did it take? What did you have to go through? How long were you in the Airbnb? How long did you have to stay at the house? What were some of the things you expected that didn't happen? So that way you can kind of get in front of the unknowns. But yes, basics, right? Are they qualified? Are they licensed? Are they insured? Do they have the proper type of insurance? All those things come into play, before, and that's not just with mold remediators. That goes for any contractor you invite into your home. You really should do a little bit of vetting. I'm not saying you have to get crazy with it, but I think it's I come from the old school, the 3 estimate method. Still, I like to get 3 estimates.
Most people still do. I'll tell you
Yeah,
that. I work with a lot of people.
Right. And you can gain a lot from that, right? Not just in regards to, what they tell you, but how much time are they willing to spend with you to educate you on the process? And you may already have a lot of education. Maybe you're not looking for that. You're just looking for an estimate, and that's fine. But for the most part, I spend a lot of time talking to people about why they're doing it in the first place, because this is a crazy evasive process. I just described a 1 to 2 to 3 room type of remediation, and you're packing out those spaces, and you're probably not living in the home because the air conditioning has to be off. That's hard. You got kids and you got animals, and you have, you're moving out, and so that process is extremely taxing and stressful. And if you're going to go through it, you need to know what you're getting yourself into. You need to understand why you're doing it in the first place, and that contractor should be taking the time to describe to you the process, and it should involve something at least similar to what I've talked about here. That's I'm not making this up. I didn't invent this process. This is not my, I don't write the book on it. I'm following the practices, and these practices are best practices that most remediators should be following and should be willing to discuss with you, because you have to have a plan. And the plan involves not just the remediator, but all the other pieces of the puzzle. The remediator is usually the tip of the sword, but you have all the other things that happen before, during, and after. And those have to be discussed as well. Otherwise, you run into a situation where you're throwing good money at a bad situation, and you have incompetent contractors working in the home, and they're just making it worse. And you come back to the home and you feel worse, because they've disturbed it, and now it's airborne in your home. You have no way of holding them accountable because no testing was done. All those scenarios, it seems like it's extreme, but it happens all the time. And Sean will tell you better than me, because they're usually the one fielding those phone calls. I don't usually hear those types of situations unless I'm being called in afterwards to help bail somebody out of a bad situation. But I'm not here to talk bad about other remediators. There are a lot of really good, competent companies out there that know what they're doing, and it just involves, finding an expert, finding people who have qualified, well-trained staff, and have somebody managing the project and making sure that there's a standard in place. And usually, if that's the case, then you can hope for the best. And nobody's perfect. Sometimes it takes more than one try to get to the standard, but it's worth doing for sure.
And finding those experts before the process starts. You don't want to be going back and forth between experts throughout the process, because nobody's ever going to agree with anybody. You need to stick with the people you feel comfortable with. So number 4 is asking about the remediation process. Should sound very similar to what Adam's been talking about tonight. And like you said, taking time to educate you on the process if you're not familiar.
Yeah, every building is different, and so the plan is always different.
Yep.
And You may have an exposure in one room and then one on the complete opposite side of the building. And so it's important. You got to plan. How are we going to do this? What makes the most sense? And ultimately, how are we going to achieve this without, without breaking too many eggs, if that's possible? So yeah, it can be a challenge. It's always a challenge. Not can be, always. There's no simple remediation jobs.
Yeah, as small as they are, you're right. Sometimes they
I
can.
wish they were simple. They never are.
Next, I'm not sure what number. I've lost this, maybe 4, maybe 3, maybe 5. I'm not sure. But a little bit of a trick question. What type of mold testing do you perform before and after remediation? The reason that's a trick question is I don't think the remediators should be doing their own testing.
No, none.
Should always be third party doing the evaluation both before and after. So if they answer explaining to you what type of test that they do as part of their services, just say thank you, and in my opinion, just say goodbye.
Yeah, I can tell you right now. You know how many mold tests I've done in my career? 0. I've never tested a project for mold. That's not my job in the process. In this state, there are 2 different licenses: the one that Sean holds and the one that I hold. You can hold both licenses, but kind of a conflict of interest to test your own work. I'm actually not opposed to people testing their own work if they're using it for the sole purpose of them testing for their own knowledge, to say, am I ready for a third party to come in and test after me? Beautiful. If that's your process, I like it. That's just another layer of information you're gathering to ensure that you've done your job properly. But yeah, no, remediators in the state of Florida don't test their own work. You may find that others don't have those those rules that would prevent them from doing it. But even before this process was a licensed process in the state, it was always done independently. And how are you going to know for sure unless you do hire somebody who doesn't have a stake in passing or failing? They're just there to collect the scientific data to ensure it was done properly. So you should bring in a third party if you have one available to you.
Regardless of whether licensing is required.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's see. Next one. How do you determine the source of the mold and prevent future growth? That should always be part of the remediator's scope, in my opinion. Is, and if you can't figure out what the source was, Adam, you're always really good at directing the homeowner to contractors that know how to figure that out and know how to fix it and make sure it never reoccurs. The last thing you want to do is remediate a house and they're calling you again 6 months down the road with the same problems.
No. I don't find joy in seeing people suffer. Mm-hmm. There's suffering involved here. Not only do a lot of my clients not feel good, but this is expensive. I talked about how evasive it is. It's not something you ever want to do more than once. And hopefully you never have to do it, because you've listened to these shows and you're like, you know what, I know how to prevent it. And ultimately, and I mean, talk to Sean about this. I encourage people not only to gain the information about the process, because I think in a lot of cases, there's a lot of DIY people out there who can do it themselves. And we want to talk about these processes, because you could be in a rural area and have no access to anybody, and have to rely on your own resources to remove this from your environment. And so we'll go into way more detail in regards to the remediation process at some point. This was just kind of a introduction to what a typical remediation is like. But if you have questions about your project right now, and you want to know how should I attack it, let us know. Comment, on this episode, email us, reach out to us. We'll talk about your scenario live on the show and try to help you navigate the process. it's really important, honestly, for me to not only try to meet the standards, which are difficult in most cases, but not only that, but to go back to what you said, help them solve the problem so it doesn't reoccur. And sometimes that's as simple as stop using crappy materials in a wet space.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, you're going to hear it in probably every episode until you're sick of hearing it. If you're not building a wet room to get wet, if you're not building a kitchen to be industrial, if you're not building your spaces so that they can have exposures to moisture, because there's moisture running through the walls and pipes and running under cabinetry and things like that. If you don't build that space intelligently, you will eventually have water damage and ultimately eventually have exposures to mold growth. And the way we build homes nowadays, cheap, light, quick, no thought put into why or how. It's all aesthetic. It all looks good, but it doesn't function well in the environments. A lot of times we put those things, and I can't wait to get into our bathroom episodes. Honestly, yeah, I can't
I
wait.
couldn't tell.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Just a few more because we're running up on an hour here.
Yeah.
But what safety precautions do you take to protect your workers? I think that speaks volume. If they're not using PPE, probably not taking the ramifications of mold exposure very seriously, and may treat your house as such. Just speaking from prior experience there.
Minimally respiratory protection, that comes first.
Yeah.
Make it available to them. I encourage them to always wear it, especially during the demo phase. Forget mold. I obviously don't want them exposed to molds, but demo period, you need to be wearing respiratory protection.
So much dust.
Minimum of N95 or better, whether it's a disposable N95 mask or you're wearing a full 3M mask with pan filters on them. It starts with respiratory, and then ultimately they need to be sure that they're not taking it with them on their self and clothing, or they should be decontaminating and cleaning themselves, either because they had clothing protection on, Tyvek suits and things like that, or ultimately decontaminating themselves when they leave the project, or leave those spaces. But for first and foremost, respiratory.
Agreed. Do you offer any guarantees or warranties for your work? That usually going to be directed towards whatever's agreed upon, in your contract and the scope of work that the client signs there. Surely any reputable remediation company is going to continue to clean until they pass some sort of post-inspection test.
Correct. The standard is to get it to a normal fungal ecology.
Yeah.
In regards to warrantying it after, no. At least that's not my process, for a multitude of reasons. I don't know who's coming in there after me.
Yeah, you can't guarantee they're going to actually address the sources that you've uncovered too.
No. Not only that, even when we get it to a normal fungal ecology, if you have a future exposure, there's a high likelihood you'll have growth. I'll say this again: we live on planet Earth. The ingredients for growth situations walk into our home with us when we open the doors a lot of times. So dry is the goal.
Yeah.
Keeping your environment as dry as possible,
as dust free as possible.
Yeah, as dust free as possible. All those things are important. Humidity control is something we don't talk enough about. And if you live in a human environment, it doesn't take a water damage event to potentially cause growth in your home or your attic or your air conditioning closet. Humidity when mixed with cold air, or humidity when it comes in contact with cold material like metal, a lot of times will condensate. and then you have standing moisture on materials, and it will soak into and leach into the materials around it, whether it be drywall or insulation or cabinetry or whatever, or the materials that the cold air is flowing through, like the duct boarding in your attic and things like that. And that's enough right there to cause a growth situation. We see it time and time again. It doesn't take a flood or a window leak or a roof leak or any type of water damage event, humidity alone, if it's not checked, can honestly be the probably the one of the worst situations you can put yourself in. It has the potential to cause the most damage widespread if you have a humidity condition in your attic or in your walls or in the interstitial space between your first and second floor. If that's somehow permeating into the environment around you, it's not something you can see outside of having, a humidistat or hygrometer in the environment. It's sometimes hard to tell, and so it's important that you focus on that as a part of the whole building health. Sean will tell you, man, it's the worst condition you can find yourself in.
So last 2 points, I think it's important for people to address with remediators up front.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on it briefly. Just help them understand how they're going to handle your belongings, not only in the affected areas, but the rest of the home if necessary. And then what type of documentation are they going to provide? You do a really good job of taking pictures along the way,
Yeah,
which is really helpful in the event we have to rely on them after the fact and understand what all was impacted, where the source came from. So it can be
yeah.
really helpful at times. So make sure they're taking pictures along the way as well.
Yeah, you want to know what they found. I mean, most of my clients, want to see the process as it progresses.
Mm-hmm.
Not only are we taking pictures and a lot of times video and things like that, but I like to FaceTime my clients while we're out there, just to kind of give them they're always curious anyways. What did you find? A lot of times I'll get the text, I don't want to know, but tell me, what did you find? I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it, but show me. So yeah, not just for my own knowledge or need to document what we did and why, and to show why we did what we did, but a lot of times there's an insurance claim going on, or there's some situation where the client needs that documentation for some reason, because they're trying to make a recovery of some type, or put somebody, who put the responsible party, give them documentation and video and photo evidence of the damage. So yeah, it's important that you document what you've got. I know not all companies do that. I come from the insurance side of things, so it's just ingrained in me to document before and after in most cases. And I try to do that and be the eyes and ears for my client.
Yeah, that's great. Like I said, it's always helpful on our end too,
Yeah,
especially when we get to the post-testing side of things, knowing exactly how much damage there was, what exactly the source was.
yeah,
We always think we have an idea, but we never know for sure
sure.
until those walls are opened up. But that's all I got on my end. If there's any listeners out there that have questions about what we talked about during this episode, or have any questions for future episodes, or just things you want us to answer, maybe even just on Instagram, social media, or
Mhm.
you want to call us and have that chat over the phone, feel free to reach out and we'll make sure we answer those questions.
Most definitely. This process is imperfect, but with as much planning as possible, you can really execute the mission, which is to remove the growth areas and get those environments as clean as possible before you reoccupy, or you rebuild. Right, you don't want to put new fresh materials back into an environment where there's elevations, because as Sean has said, first of all, you're kind of potentially having additional exposures or continuing to have exposures to elevated levels that are in the dust in that environment. And it could, with just a small exposure to moisture, could potentially become a big situation again. So it's important for a multitude of reasons, but we'd love to hear from you. I would love to discuss your situation, your scenario, so we can help, be part of your solution.
100%, 100%. And we've had some people reach out that I think are willing to share their stories. So hopefully we can get them on here pretty soon and have people that listeners can relate to.
Absolutely. We're going to do a lot of these shows, and it's going to be rewarding for everybody involved, especially if we are actively helping people work through their issues, or plan for future projects of their own, or circle back to projects that have been done but maybe not done properly necessarily. All those things, or at least help you with a starting point of how do I evaluate the situation so I can intelligently attack these areas. So that's where you start. You got to start with gaining the information, hiring good people to assess the situation, hiring good qualified people to help remediate and remove the growth, and then hiring qualified contractors on the back end to rebuild those areas properly so you can avoid having these exposures in the future.
Well, that's all I got for tonight. Hopefully, I feel like that was very helpful, listening to you walk through how you do things and what people should expect from a remediator. I hope nobody feels like that was long-winded on either of our ends, but I feel like the more information you have, the better equipped you'll be to attack a remediation situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's all about gathering information.
Yep.
I consult more than I remediate. I talk to people and talk to them about their projects, and a lot of times it's not a good fit timing wise, or they have to have it done yesterday and I'm not available for a while. So, but educating them on the process is something I always try to do, and I encourage you guys to gain as much knowledge about your project as you possibly can before you have somebody swing the hammer. That way you can not only protect yourself, but hire somebody who's competent to do it in the first place.
All right, Adam. Well, thanks for your insight on all that, and hopefully we'll talk to you guys next time.
Yeah, absolutely. See you on the next one.
Bye.